Welcome to another episode of Managing the Problems of Daily Living. We are delighted today to feature new author, PhD, Dr. Marissa Franco, who is going to discuss her wonderful new book, Platonic, How the Science of Attachment Can Help You Make and Keep Friends. Welcome, Dr. Franco.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. I understand that this book was written during the pandemic. What compelled you to write this book in the first place?
Yeah, so it was a long time ago that the seeds were sort of planted for me to write Platonic. In my young 20s, I went through these breakups and I felt really bad. And I decided to heal. I wanted to start this wellness group with my friends. So we would meet up each week and we would do yoga together and meditate and cook together. And it felt so healing for me. And it wasn't the wellness per se, as much as it was the community, just being around these people who I love, who loved me every week. And experiencing that group and just experiencing how profound our love was for each other made me begin to question some of the beliefs I had that had really made these breakups so hard, which was, romantic love is the only love that makes me worthy. I only have love in my life if I have this romantic love. And I was sort of like, why doesn't this matter? I have these people that love me so much. Why doesn't this love count? And I kind of realized, like, in this very lonely, disconnected society, we shouldn't be throwing any form of love away. It's sort of like, I see friendship as like gold under our feet that we treat as concrete. So I kind of just wanted to be part of a culture that elevates all different forms of love rather than just romantic.
And I think, in fact, you talk about the origins, or by definition, platonic love. We think of it as kind of less than. But in your book, you talk about the power of platonic love and why it's so valuable.
Exactly. It's a love, in its original definition was a love that transcends the physical. So the fact that it wasn't physical was a sign of just how meaningful and how profound it is. And so I think, all types of love offer us something, right? And all types of love are beautiful. But I just wanted to sort of argue, like, platonic love too, is also meaningful. And, I think especially for people that are single and don't have that romantic love in their life, like, I think now I see it as, well, that's also an offering and an opportunity to spend more time with friends. And there's really no lesser status when it comes to connection. It's just that we need connection, but we don't all necessarily need this one form of connection that we've all been told is the primary or the elite form of connection. And that even, this hierarchy that we put on love, it also hurts people that are married, because we know from the research that, you're not only are you less depressed if you have friends, but your spouse becomes less depressed. We find that when you enter into conflict with your spouse, it affects your release of the stress hormone cortisol in negative ways, but not if you have quality connection outside of your marriage. So, no matter what type of relationship you're in, you still have love and you still have connection. And fundamentally, we have always needed, and we still need now, an entire community to feel whole.
And we're going to talk a lot about the scientific origins and the behavioral outcome studies that you base, your book on, and these strategies. But in fact, loneliness has a physical harmful effect, right? I think you talk about isolation can impact on our overall wellness. We get sicker.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's fascinating when you go into the health impact of loneliness, because, I cite in the book that, for example, diet, exercise, all of those contribute to our longevity, but social connection contributes to our longevity more so than diet and exercise, at a rate that's sort of like the impact of diet and exercise combined. So if we want to achieve optimal physical health, right, it's obviously important to still eat healthy and to exercise. I think some of my students hear these stats and they're like, well, now I can just eat candy and hang out with friends. And I'm like, all three are good. But, we should be focusing on being connected a lot more, whereas it's not as big a part of our public health priorities, for example, now. And then there's the commonly cited statistic that loneliness is as toxic as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And we just find across the board that whatever physical ailment that you might be experiencing, whether it's breast cancer or personality disorder, mental health issues, mental or physical ailment, I should say, or Alzheimer's, right? That loneliness, if you're lonely, it really amplifies the physical decline.
Correct. Right. Absolutely. I did want to say that you quote another statistic, which is kind of the thesis for your book, that the average American adult has not made a new friend in 5 years.
Yeah, yeah. And friendships networks have been shrinking for the last several decades. It started really in the 1950s. It started getting a lot worse. And Robert Putnam has this great book, Bowling Alone. He looks at all the reasons why that might be happening. And it was the creation of the television. Before then, people spent their leisure time hanging out with other people, but then they started to spend leisure alone. And in 2012, loneliness began to spike a lot more. And we see this as a global trend. In 35 out of 37 countries, kids reported high rates of loneliness at school from earlier 2000s to now. And so globally, we are entering into this crisis of loneliness that's only been getting worse. And I acknowledge that. There's a lot of systemic reasons for that, right? Like the way technology is designed, it's not for connection, it's for disconnection, although you can use it for a tool of connection. But Platonic is basically here to say there's systemic reasons for this, why we're so lonely. It's not necessarily your fault, but you can swim upstream against it and still find connection. And here's how to do it.
You speak so beautifully. There are all kinds of barriers. We're going to now move from the literature. We're going to quote some of the studies, but learn what we can do. We are spending more time at home, right? I mean, we can exercise at home, we can work from home, and the opportunities are fewer. But I also think that some people have predetermined personality variables that make it harder. And you talk about that in your book also. There are earlier attachments.
Yep. Yeah, so my book is basically the idea that our personalities are fundamentally a reflection of our experiences of connection or lack thereof. Like if you're friendly, warm, vulnerable, trusting, cynical, aggressive, right? Those are all things that are predicated on previous experiences of connection. And so what happens is we kind of embody these experiences of connection or lack thereof become part of our body. They become part of how we see in the world, how they become part of our very characters, right? And that's what attachment theory kind of is, right? These people that have had these healthy connections in the past, they then develop a sort of personality or a sort of set of internalized assumptions about others that then facilitate continued connection. Like they think other people will like them. They think they can trust people. They think they can be vulnerable with people. They think, people are just kind of looking out for them. And that sort of assumption really facilitates connection. Whereas anxiously attached people, because they've received very inconsistent love, their assumption is that people will abandon me, which harms their ability to connect so much because they're seeing rejection when it's not there. And then they're withdrawing, even though someone's not, abandoning them per se. And then avoidantly attached people who think if we get too close, you're going to betray me or exploit me or harm me, see me as weak. So they're never vulnerable with anyone. And they tend to not have as strong connections because of that. They don't initiate new connections. They don't connect around vulnerability like the other attachment styles. So there is this way that our past connections are very much with us now. They're not quite in the past, and they affect our ability to continue to connect. And Platonic is really about, well, no matter what your attachment style was in the past, no matter what your connections have looked like in the past, you can still connect with people. You can still find security. And so here are the different practices I share for how to become more secure.
Right. So we're going to get into the how-tos. So in terms of your book, the practices to make and keep friends, you talk about 8 talking points here. Taking initiative, and we're going to expound on some of these. Taking initiative, expressing vulnerability, pursuing authenticity, harmonizing with anger, offering generosity, and giving affection. So let's start with the first one. I'm actually asked this question personally and professionally. All right, you're right. I need to get out there more. How do I do that? How do I take initiative and connect with people?
Yeah, well, I think we can take for granted the idea that I need to get out there, but some people don't even know that because they think friendship needs to happen organically and I shouldn't have to try. And these friends are going to kind of plop into my life like fruit flies to fruits, but that is not true. And especially in adulthood, friendship does not happen organically. People who think it does are lonelier over time. And so we do need to put ourselves out there. I talk about how we can do that in strategic ways. First of all, people are so afraid of rejection. I like to tell people about research on the liking gap, where when strangers interact and researchers ask them, how much do you think this person likes you? How much do you like them? People across the board underestimate how liked they are by others. So the truth is you're less likely to get rejected than you think you are. And so one, I think, implication of that I tell people when it comes to connecting is that you have to assume people like you. Because when researchers told people, based on your personality, you're going to go into this group and be liked, in fact, even though that was a lie, people became more friendly and warmer, and it was a self-fulfilling prophecy where we know from the research that those people that fear rejection, they tend to be cold and withdrawn toward others. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They're actually coming off as rejecting people, and people are then rejecting them in return, right? Mm-hmm. So assuming people like you, understanding you're less likely to be rejected than you think. And then my last tip is like, join something repeated over time. Like find a way to do your hobby and community with others, because when you do, you capitalize on something called the mere exposure effect, which is our unconscious tendency to like people simply because they're familiar. Like there's one study where these researchers planted women in a classroom, and students didn't remember any of the women because it was a huge lecture class, but they reported at the end of the semester that they liked the woman who had showed up for the most classes 20% more than the one who didn't show up for any. So it's just our unconscious tendency. They didn't even remember these people. So if you join something that's like a one-off, like you go to like a single happy hour, right? It's going to be a lot harder to connect than if you join something that's repeated, because the mere exposure effect will begin to set in for you.
That particular factoid resonated with me, right? Because if you're going to the same program, the same class, it does happen, to use your words, organically, right? Mm-hmm. How are you? How are you doing on that equipment? Nice to see you again. It's easier.
Yep.
It's easier. Okay. Then you also talk about expressing vulnerability, which I think is very difficult for a lot of people because of their concerns about rejection and looking weak.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the thing about vulnerability is that I see often that if we had one experience where the vulnerability didn't go correctly, we then fear it forever and might ignore the times that it really bonds us. There's definitely like this confirmation bias that can happen. And so, but what we know from the research, for example, is that actually intimately self-disclosing about yourself makes people like you more, even if you might have had that negative experience. Or the beautiful mess effect, which is this finding that when people are vulnerable, they underestimate how positively they're perceived and overestimate how negatively they think they're perceived, right? Because they see it as people are judging me, but actually people tend to perceive you as more authentic. And so there's this way that vulnerability can really create and foster connection. But at the same time, it's a risk, right? It's not going to happen all the time. But sometimes when it doesn't go well, it's important to remember that it can also be about the receiver, right? If someone's avoidantly attached, they're uncomfortable with vulnerability in themselves and others. So when you're talking to someone that's avoidantly attached, and typically when you're vulnerable, you feel closer to someone, you might not with someone who's avoidantly attached because of their own associations and baggage around vulnerability. So it's important to remember that as well, that if you're vulnerable and it didn't work out, it doesn't mean you necessarily did something really wrong. It might just be that this isn't the right person for your vulnerability, and that you can, instead of deciding not to be vulnerable anymore, try to choose someone else who might be a safer alternative.
Well, you do talk about oversharing in your book and kind of choosing wisely and scaffolding vulnerability. I talk to my people about levels of intimacy. And again, the talking back to that so-called rejection is really the CBT that you and I were talking about when we sat down today, that we're challenging those negative thoughts. And maybe that particular individual might have an issue, a family of origin problem or something where they cannot hear or receive what I'm telling them. And maybe, I have to work harder at figuring that out. But I think that there's also risk. You talk a lot about that. If you don't take the risk, right, you're still in your apartment or your home by yourself.
The biggest risk is taking no risk, because then you're completely isolated, right? Like we think of these acts of self-protection, like I'm not going to share myself. I'm not going to be vulnerable. I'm not going to tell people how great they are. We think of those as risky, right? But ultimately, if you're stuck in this place of self-protection where you're not doing any of these behaviors that create connection, you are guaranteed to face the biggest risk, which is being isolated and being lonely. So fundamentally,
Right.
all this self-protection accumulatively becomes a form of self-harm.
Correct. We are going to speak more with Dr. Franco after the break about how to create these friendships and increase or enhance those relationships. And we will be back.
If you love them enough to crawl into a play place to get them to come down, then surely you'll check nhtsa.gov/the-right-seat to make sure they're in the right car seat.
Welcome back to a very special episode of Managing the Problems of Daily Living. We are truly honored and privileged today to have Dr. Marissa Franco here to discuss her new book, Platonic, How the Science of Attachment Can Help You Make and Keep Friends. Dr. Franco, if people want to speak with you directly, how might they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so on my website, drmarissagfranco.com, that's DrMarissagFranco, you can take a quiz that assesses your strengths and weaknesses as a friend and gives you suggestions to improve. You can reach out. I do speaking engagements on connection or belonging. And if you want more tips, you can follow me on Instagram at Dr. Marissa G. Franco, where I share research-based tips on connection.
Fantastic. Okay. So we ended the half talking about vulnerability. What about this concept of pursuing authenticity? What is that?
Oh, this is my favorite chapter of the book because it took me a while to understand what the heck is authenticity. Like, we talk about it as a true self, but what is a true self? And so as I read the research, the theme that I saw is that people report feeling most authentic when they're most safe. And so I define authenticity as a state of presence that we access when we feel safe and we're not hijacked by defense mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean, right? That means sometimes the things we say automatically are not the most authentic thing because those are often defense mechanisms or reflexes to protect ourselves from an actual authentic feeling that we're trying to obscure. So I know that all sounds very abstract. Let me give you an example.
Please.
So let's say my kid didn't get into any Ivy League schools. I was really hoping that they would. My friend's kid gets into Brown. And my authentic feeling is that I feel jealous, right? But my defense mechanism is to protect myself from that authentic feeling is to say, well, Brown isn't actually the best Ivy League, right? Like, there's other Ivy Leagues that are better, but like, good for her, right? So we often use these defense mechanisms to protect ourselves, to protect our feelings at the costs of our relationships, right? If I'm yelling and screaming at you, it's a defense mechanism often against feeling hurt by you, for example. And so being authentic really facilitates connection because if we're authentic, we can say, I'd love to be happy for you, but a part of me is feeling a bit jealous. Or we can say, I am really happy for you because a part of me is happy for you, even alongside that jealousy, right? Instead of putting someone down. And so when we're authentic, we don't engage in these defense mechanisms that fundamentally harm our relationship, which is why it's a great tool for connection.
Don't you also say, perhaps in an interview that you did, that the more content we are and happy with our own lives, the happier we can be with our friends and the more present we are for our friends?
That's not trademark Marissa, but I absolutely co-sign. I think about the ways that like being in a good mood, for example, is a great tool for connecting. It's a great resource for being better at connecting. And there is research that shows that people that are in a negative mood actually like other people less when they interact with them. And so I think there is this way that obviously our own attachment, our own mental health, our own well-being can facilitate or impede our ability to connect with others.
You also talk about in another chapter harmonizing with anger, and you speak of mirror neurons with babies when they're crying.
Yeah, that babies cry when they hear other babies cry, that we're naturally kind of empathic toward other people, right? And that I think authenticity is really important because at our core, we are loving and we are empathic, and it's only our pain and our suffering and our defense mechanisms, right, that are there to protect us from other people in sort of these glitchy ways that get in the way of that. But I believe that if we're in touch with our core and we're in touch with who we really are, like we're fundamentally social creatures, we're fundamentally good creatures. And being secure, I do argue, is a way to be more authentic, because securely attached people, they're more empathic, more generous toward others, because it's like their own pain doesn't get in the way of how much they're able to empathize with others. If I'm, insecurely attached, and you tend to feel a lot more negative emotions in your relationships, particularly for people that are anxiously attached, right? It's like basically if you think you're walking around with this huge wound, how could you think about other people's needs? How could you think about how you're coming off to other people? You're just like, do this for me. I need you to do this right away. Or I'm upset with you, right? You're getting to that more reactive place because you have to regulate this huge wound. And so finding that secure attachment is being able to heal a little bit of that wound, so that you then have more resources to think about your experiences, but also to think more about other people, and to kind of leave space to release the love that I think is inside all of us.
So if we're coming from a place with insecure attachments and it makes it harder to connect with people, how do we manage that? How do we rectify those wounds?
Yeah. Well, this is a great question, and it is what the book is about. So I have a lot of tips on this in the book. The one that I will say that I think is really, really important, and we tend to see insecure people, I talk about in my chapter on attachment, these studies wherein these kids are they read about an experience about being in a cafeteria, and you see your friend drop milk on you, and how do you interpret that? And these secure people tend to think, my friend is clumsy, and they're well-meaning. But the insecurely attached people are like, my friend went out of their way to hurt me, and now I have to slosh this milk on them right back. They want revenge. And so there's this way that being securely attached means that you assume others people have positive intent, and you assume that people like you, right? That they want the best for you. And this is a tip that I think is really important, because if you go into vulnerability, assuming people like you, it's going to make you be more vulnerable. If you go into conflict, assuming people like you, it's going to allow you to bring up that conflict in a way that's not attacking other people like insecurely attached people might do. Like across the board, having this internalized sense that other people like and value you really helps facilitate that connection. In terms of how to do this, because it's one thing to understand this intellectually, but another thing to embody it, I really like this framework from a psychologist, Rick Hansen, and he has this framework called HEAL, which means that when you have an experience of social safety, like social safety means it could be someone smiling at you, it could be someone texting you, it could be someone holding the door for you, right? That you actually savor that and you receive it and you focus on it until you feel a positive emotion and you picture it melting into your body. And what that does is, because when you're insecurely attached, you're hyper vigilant for signs that others are going to reject or abandon you or judge you because that was your past, and you're ignoring all these signs that people are loving you and accepting you. And so it takes an intentional practice to now start focusing on all of these experiences of love and acceptance that we receive every day in so many tiny ways from other people, to help you develop the internalized and embodied sense, so that your body's telling you that people do like me in a given interaction. And that's the sense that people that are more secure have.
And we go back to CBT, instead of, assuming that utilizing a negative filter, that you kind of hunt for the good, and you
Exactly.
see all of these blessings and opportunities for gratefulness. Okay. You also talk about offering generosity in terms of connecting. What does that mean?
Yeah. So generosity, people that are more generous have more friends. And so it's anything that you can do to be kind and loving towards other people is really going to help you make friends. But I had this tension in that chapter because, I think especially as women, some of us have been socialized to be completely self-sacrificing, right? Our generosity burns us out. We're exhausted. We always feel guilty that we're not doing enough, right? And what I found from the research is that that's called unmitigated giving. And it's related to poorer mental health. And it's related to not having as good of a relationship compared to those people who are generous with boundaries. And in fact, when people receive generosity from these unmitigated givers who give to the point of exhaustion, they actually tend to be more uncomfortable with it because they can tell that this person doesn't really want to do this for them. And so what I kind of argue for in the generosity chapter is that we need to be generous towards others in a way in which we are considering our needs and their needs at the same time, right? So if I know, for example, this birthday party is really important to my friend and I'm really tired, I still might make it a priority because I'm thinking about my friend's needs being the more urgent of the two of us in this moment, right? But if I'm really tired and my friend wants to hang out on a Friday, I might say, no, sorry, no, I'm really tired, because I'm, again, thinking about both of our needs and what's the right option to fulfill both of our needs, or to prioritize whose needs are most urgent in the given moment. That's how we can be generous. We can be loving towards others, but we can still not abandon ourselves in the process.
I think that's a key element, as you're talking about, dependency. I think in any healthy relationship, I've always learned there has to be kind of mutual dependency and reciprocity.
Agreed. Yes.
I think if it's one way, that gets into a whole nother arena.
Exactly. And I think we need to reserve mutuality for people that are also mutual with us. I think there's a difference between mutuality and dependency. If someone's always calling you in a crisis and is expecting you to help them and not really thinking about, your own well-being, or that's the only thing that happens in your friendship is you're talking about their crises and there's no other chapters to it, where you're not just like hanging out and doing monotonous things together, right? That's dependency to me and not mutuality. So I think mutuality, because it's resource intensive, right? To be engaged in a mutual relationship with people, that before we can take that step towards mutuality, we have to be discerning, who do I want to engage in mutuality with, and also give ourselves permission to not engage with it with everybody, right? There's certain people that we may not want that same level of connection with, that we might have to set more boundaries with so that we have more time and space for those people that we do want connections with. So I think discernment is the necessary prerequisite to successful mutuality.
That's a good word, discernment. The last point was giving affection. We have very little time. What would you say, kind of in a minute or less, is important in terms of that chapter?
Well, I used to think people wanted to be friends with someone who's smart, funny, charismatic. And what I found from the research was that's the least important quality people look for in a friend. And the most important quality is someone who makes them feel like they matter. And when researchers followed friendship pairs for 12 weeks, the ones that blossomed the most were the ones where people shared high amounts of affection towards each other. So affection, telling people how much you love them, how much they matter to you, is a wonderful tool for deep connection.
And you even talk about reaching out during COVID with memes, with texts, just to show people that you're thinking about them.
Yeah. Show the people in your life they're important to you. Don't take them for granted.
What do you think about a future focus, Dr. Franco, for yourself in your career?
Well, I think when I talked about the systemic piece, I think connection work has to also challenge systemic racism, sexism, homophobia, right, which are all bounded with dehumanizing people. And so I think I would love to think about how to leverage the researchers' resource on connection to create a more inclusive society where everybody feels loved, no matter what their unique identities or backgrounds are.
I think that you are a gift to our profession as a young professional, and you have so much to offer. Thank you for bringing this book to us, and I look forward to practicing the strategies and utilizing them with my client population. So thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me.